Something big has just happened in Moscow, and it may tell us more about the state of Russia's war economy than any official statement ever could. I am Walter Benson, and this is my channel, Walter Benson. If you value serious reporting, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, Walter Benson, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this report with others. Now to the story. Vladimir Putin was hoping the war involving Iran and the shock in global energy markets would give his economy room to breathe. Instead, reports say he brought Russian oligarchs into the Kremlin, closed the doors, and made a request. Russia, he said, will keep fighting until it captures the rest of Donbass. But the Kremlin has a budget problem, and the pressure is growing. So now, the men who made fortunes from the war machine are being asked to give some of that money back to the state. That moment matters because it reveals how narrow Putin's options may have become.
A politician asking wealthy insiders for money does not automatically mean collapse is near. But it does raise a serious question. Why would the Kremlin need private generosity if the war economy is working the way Russian officials claim? According to the report, Putin made clear that Russia intends to continue the war without changing course. Yet behind that message of determination sits a widening hole in the federal budget. The state needs money to fund military production, sustain battlefield operations, and hold together an economy that has been bent around conflict for years. And now, instead of presenting new state resources, the Kremlin appears to be leaning on the same elite class that has profited from defense contracts, military demand, and the closed system built around this invasion. This did not happen in isolation. Putin has already tried other ways to plug that gap.
Last year, the Russian state moved against oligarchs who were seen as less loyal, less useful, or simply not aligned with the project of permanent war. Roughly $50 billion in assets were reportedly seized from businessmen who were not fully on board with the Kremlin's direction. In a normal system, that would trigger legal warfare, political resistance, and public scrutiny. In Russia, it mostly showed how power works. If the state decides you are in the way, your property can disappear with you. But even that massive transfer was not enough. The war kept consuming money. The economy kept straining under sanctions and distortion, and the Kremlin still could not close the gap between what it needed to spend and what it could safely extract. Then came another attempt. In January, the government raised the burden on ordinary Russians and on small businesses through new taxes. That was supposed to bring in more revenue and spread the pain downward.
But there was a limit to what could be taken. Russian households were not sitting on deep reserves. Small firms were already operating under pressure. The state asked more from people who had very little room left to give. So the tax push failed to solve the deeper problem. That is what makes this latest move so striking. Putin is now turning not to opponents, but to supporters. Not to critics of the invasion, but to those who benefited from it. The message seems simple. If you made billions from this war, then now you are expected to help finance its continuation. Officially, it is not coercion. It is presented as patriotism. In practice, the distinction may be very thin. What happened next only made the story more revealing. When the Kremlin was asked about the report, it denied the idea in a very careful way. The answer was not that no money was discussed. The answer was that Putin did not invent the idea himself. Instead, the spokesman said the businessmen had offered to donate on their own. In other words, Russia was not begging. Wealthy patriots were simply volunteering support, and the president was gracious enough not to refuse. That response did not close the story. It widened it. Because when power is concentrated that tightly, nobody needs to say the words directly. A locked room in the Kremlin does not require a formal order. The structure speaks for itself. And that takes us to the deeper puzzle. If oil prices rose after the Iran war disrupted the Strait of Hormuz, and if Russian oil became more valuable, then why does Moscow still need emergency generosity from its oligarchs? At first glance, the logic should favor Russia. The crisis in the Gulf pushed energy prices higher. Russian media quickly framed that as proof that Moscow was in a stronger position. Their message was blunt. Donald Trump looked trapped. America had failed to secure a strategic breakthrough. High oil prices were helping Russia, while pressure was building across Europe. Moscow also welcomed the temporary easing of some American sanctions on Russian oil. That created hope in Russia that broader relief might eventually follow. At the same time, officials and commentators in Moscow were pleased to hear warnings from Kyiv that Ukraine could face missile shortages because of the conflict in the Middle East. They also noted Trump's frustration toward NATO allies over naval support in the Strait of Hormuz. Inside Russia, all of this was presented as a favorable turn. The wider world was distracted, oil was expensive, and Moscow appeared ready to profit. And in the short term, there was some truth in that. Before this crisis, oil prices had been relatively low. On top of that, Russia had often been forced to sell at a discount because of sanctions and shipping risk. Then the market shifted.
Prices rose, and Russian barrels became more attractive because Russia could still move supply that others suddenly could not. Reports suggested Moscow was making huge additional sums each day from this combination of higher prices and improved leverage. But there was always a second edge to this moment. A long conflict in the Gulf, with sustained extreme energy prices, could push the global economy toward recession. If that happens, demand falls. And when demand falls, even high prices stop being enough. More importantly, Putin's own war had already created a separate vulnerability. Russia might be earning more on paper, but the infrastructure needed to move and process that oil was no longer secure. That vulnerability came into sharp focus on March 23rd, when Ukraine launched a major strike on the Primorsk oil terminal. This was not just another attack. It hit one of Russia's most important oil export points on the Baltic Sea. As pressure grew around the Black Sea, and as Russian ports and refineries faced repeated threats closer to the war zone, the Baltic had become more important than ever. Moscow treated that corridor as safer, more distant, and harder for Ukraine to reach. That assumption no longer holds. Once a terminal like Primorsk is hit, the damage goes beyond fire and steel. It changes the psychology of the market. Traders, insurers, port operators, and shipping companies all begin to reassess the risk. A place once considered secure becomes uncertain overnight. And for a country relying on energy exports to sustain both state revenue and military spending, uncertainty is expensive. That is where the real damage begins. Even if Ukraine never struck the same site again, the first successful hit would still have consequences. Tankers worth hundreds of millions of dollars now look more vulnerable. Insurance costs rise sharply. Margins narrow. Revenue that looks strong on paper begins to disappear into risk pricing, delay, and protection costs. Every day a major terminal is partly offline, the Kremlin loses tax income. Cargo cannot move normally when infrastructure is damaged, threatened, or burning. Russia can still sell crude when routes are open, but every disruption chips away at the advantage created by higher global prices. So while Moscow may earn more per barrel in theory, it may still collect less than expected in practice because the chain that turns oil into cash keeps getting interrupted. This is the core of the contradiction. Russia is benefiting from crisis abroad while simultaneously bleeding from attacks at home. Then there is the repair problem, which may be even more serious over time. Russia's oil industry was built with heavy reliance on Western technology, Western systems, and Western components. Sanctions relief in one area does not erase the broader restrictions still in place. So, when refineries, depots, and terminals are damaged, fixing them is not simple. The equipment required is often no longer available through normal channels. It has to be sourced indirectly, through intermediaries, hidden routes, inflated costs, and constant delay. The longer the war continues, the harder this becomes. Russian officials can improvise. They can buy under the table. They can reroute supply chains. But each workaround takes time, adds expense, and creates new exposure.
Reports have suggested that around 40% of Russian oil export capacity has been affected by Ukrainian attacks. That is not a symbolic issue. That is pressure on the bloodstream of the state. And the pressure did not stop with one strike. In the span of a single week, Ukraine reportedly carried out similar attacks 3 times. At that pace, this is no longer an isolated incident. It is becoming a campaign.
Russian exporters have even warned that force majeure may be necessary in some cases, meaning contracts could be broken because shipments can no longer be guaranteed under the threat of drone attacks. At the same time, the Russian government has moved to ban gasoline exports for the next 2 months. That decision reflects another layer of strain. Refineries damaged by attack cannot process enough crude into fuel. Domestic demand still has to be met, so Moscow is holding back gasoline at home because supply is no longer secure enough to send it abroad. Crude oil exports continue when possible, but even that is happening under growing pressure. The country Putin expected to conquer is now directly constraining his ability to finance the war. That may be the most important conclusion of all. Putin launched what was supposed to be a short operation. Years later, it has become a long war of attrition, and the economic cost is no longer abstract. It is now visible in seized assets, heavier taxes, emergency denials, export restrictions, damaged terminals, and a Kremlin reportedly asking its richest loyalists for money. This is not just a battlefield story. It is a story about whether Russia can keep paying for the war at the level the Kremlin demands. And that question is becoming harder to hide. If you found this report valuable, subscribe to my channel, Walter Benson. Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this video with others who follow global politics and economics. What happened in Moscow may be more than a financial embarrassment. It may be a warning that the system funding this war is under deeper strain than the Kremlin wants the world to see.